Okay. Coming to the first topic of today, topic is metabolic syndrome. It is also called as syndrome X, also known as insulin resistance syndrome. Basically, it is a constellation of metabolic abnormalities that confer increased cardiovascular disease risk and increased chance of developing diabetes mellitus. As you all know, this metabolic syndrome is a combination of this basically 5 main features, which is central obesity, uh, hypertriglyceridemia, decreased HDL, and hyperglycemia and hypertension. Coming to the diagnostic criteria, various bodies have given various definitions of this diagnostic criteria for this metabolic syndrome, out of which most commonly followed was NCEP ATP3 2001 criteria. Uh, Out of these 5 main features, it says that if 3 or more are present, we can call it as metabolic syndrome. Central obesity, they have defined as waist circumference 102. I think all females 88 centimeters. Hypertriglyceridemia as triglyceride level more than 150 milligrams per dl. HDL in males it is less than 40, females less than 50. Blood pressure 130/85, and glucose, increased glucose as more than 100 milligrams per dl. Coming to the prevalence of this metabolic syndrome in various populations, the prevalence rates will be, will will be different based on the different criteria they have used. Uh, Based on NCEP criteria in 2010, United States, they have reported as it as 22%. With the same NCEP criteria in India in 2004, they have reported metabolic syndrome prevalence as 46% in Indians. This criteria also, the prevalence rates also changes with in the males and females. Coming to risk factors, there are many risk factors that you can expect. Overweight and obesity, sedentary lifestyle, aging, diabetes mellitus, lipodystrophy. There are some form of genetic lipodystrophies which will lead to metabolic syndrome, and acquired lipodystrophies like HIV-related lipodystrophy, who are patients on ART, can also lead to metabolic syndrome. In this metabolic syndrome, the most important part is the pathogenesis. How these 5 main components uh, will be present and how they will increase the cardiovascular risk. Coming to the first one, which is hyperglycemia, or also this known as this insulin resistance. The mechanism of this insulin resistance is incompletely understood. Coming to mechanisms which can explain the insulin resistance in metabolic syndrome. Uh, in adipose tissue, this insulin, when it acts normally, it inhibits lipolysis and it will promote lipoprotein lipase. Whereas in case of resistance, which is there are in case of if in the presence of insulin resistance, there is increased lipolysis. As you can expect, this increased lipolysis will lead to increased release of fatty acids into the portal blood. This leads to increased fatty acids. This increased fatty acids. Coming to the first one, this increased fatty acids impair insulin-mediated glucose uptake. So thus, the blood glucose content will increase, and the same fatty acids will be traveling to the liver, where they are metabolized into glucose, which is released into the blood, leading to increased glucose, and it is also it also used in the formation of triglycerides. So there will be hypertriglyceridemia. These fatty acids also, as we have discussed, it leads to insulin resistance. This insulin resistance leads to increased lipolysis, and this circuit will continue to happen. Coming to another mechanism of this hyperglycemia or insulin resistance, it is leptin resistance. The physiological effects of this leptin are leptin reduces normal physiological function is it reduces appetite, it promotes energy expenditure, it enhances insulin sensitivity, and it also is used in nitric oxide dependent vascular function. In case of obesity, there is leptin resistance and leading to hyperleptinemia. Because of this leptin resistance, the physiological effects of this leptin will be lost. So there will be insulin resistance leading to hyperglycemia, hyperlipidemia, inflammation, hypertension, and atherosclerosis. Coming to other mechanisms of insulin resistance are oxidative stress hypothesis. With increasing age and this other risk factors like smoking and all, there will be increased oxidative stress, and this also leads to resistance. One more new concept is that this gut microbiome mechanism, in which it is still under research. This gut alteration in the gut microbiome may also lead to insulin resistance. This generally a few antibiotics like mostly macrolides and all will change this gut microbiome, and they have documented that patients who take this long-term macrolides for anti-inflammatory action develop this metabolic syndrome. Coming to the second component of metabolic syndrome, increased waist circumference. It has, as you all know, the increased fat in the lower parts of the body, especially the hips and thighs, is not associated with increased cardiovascular disease, or there will be no risk for type 2 diabetes. This abdominal obesity, in particular, the visceral adipose tissue. The visceral adipose tissue includes this omental fat, mesenteric fat, retroperitoneal fat, increases the risk of metabolic syndrome. Whereas when compared to the visceral, in the case of this abdominal obesity, I mean, the fat accumulation can be subcutaneous or visceral adipose. The subcutaneous fat in a abdominal position also is not associated with increased risk. The mechanism why only this abdominal visceral adipose tissue leads to increased risk is they have proposed a few theories. Portal free fatty acid hypothesis. In this, as we have just discussed, this lipolysis in the omental fat leads to increased free fatty acids in the portal vein, and these will be delivered to the liver, where there will be increased glucose production and increased triglycerides, leading to metabolic syndrome. The other second hypothesis is that coming to the diagram, this is a adipose tissue. When there is excess caloric intake, in case of subcutaneous tissue, whether it is abdominal or thighs and lower limbs, the excess caloric intake will be deposited as fat through hyperplasia mechanism. This hyperplasia mechanism, there will be no lipid. This is a physiological mechanism in which there will be no lipids spill over into the blood. There will be no systemic inflammation. So there will be no insulin resistance. And this, though the patient is fatty, this is called as healthy cardiometabolic risk profile. Though the patient is fatty, it doesn't lead to metabolic syndrome. Coming to the deranged mechanism of this increased caloric intake, when the subcutaneous adipose tissue formation is impaired because of genetic or some ART-induced drugs or some other mechanism, this will lead to visceral adipose tissue increase. This visceral adipose tissue increase is because of the hypertrophy. This hypertrophy, the formation of the adipose tissue is not correct, in which there will be lipid spillover into the blood and systemic inflammation, active inflammation here. This will lead to insulin resistance, and this is called as undesirable cardiometabolic profile, thus leading to metabolic syndrome. This macrophage accumulation will happen in case of abdominal obesity. There will be local inflammation, increased adipokines, which are released into the circulation, leading to increased metabolic risk. And it has also been mentioned that in case of abdominal adipose tissue, there will be activation of sympathetic nervous system, and this also activated sympathetic nervous system will also lead to metabolic syndrome. The third mechanism is the same, which we have discussed. This visceral adipose tissue is a marker of dysfunctional subcutaneous adipose tissue. When there is dysfunctional subcutaneous adipose tissue, the fat, the excess calorie will be deposited in the abdominal tissue and leading to this thing. Coming to the third component of the metabolic syndrome, dyslipidemia. The increased fatty acids, which are delivered into the portal circulation, will be taken up by the liver, which leads to increased production of triglycerides and increased VLDL. Thus, the hypertriglyceridemia will happen in case of metabolic syndrome. Coming to decrease in HDL, the increased triglycerides they have mentioned like the increased triglyceride lead to decrease in the cholesterol content of the HDL, and the HDL becomes small and dense, and these are the small dense HDL which are not normal will have increased clearance from the blood. So the HDL content is decreased in case of metabolic syndrome. Coming to LDL, the increase all the mechanisms can be explained by the triglycerides itself. The increased triglycerides, there will be modified LDL lipid content, and this leads to small dense LDL particles which are more atherogenic, as you all know. Coming to the fourth component of the metabolic syndrome, hypertension. How this hypertension develops in case of this metabolic syndrome. As we have seen that the obesity will lead to insulin resistance, and this insulin resistance is one of the important mechanism in the development of hypertension. Mechanism. It was given that insulin in normal people is a vasodilator, and this insulin also acts by increasing sodium resorption from the kidney. In case of insulin resistance, the vasodilatory effect of the insulin is lost, and the increased sodium resorption effect is preserved. So this combined effect of decreased vasodilatory effect and increased sodium resorption, preserved sodium resorption effect will lead to hypertension. The insulin also is a activator of sympathetic nervous system. This may also lead to hypertension, and based on this mechanism, phosphoinositol 3 kinase pathway will be giving this nitric oxide and all. So in hyper insulin resistance, there will be decreased nitric oxide and increased endothelin, leading to hypertension. Hyperinsulinemia will also lead to hyperuricemia, which affects on the kidney, and it increases renin activating system and decreases nitric oxide synthase mechanisms, and also lead to hypertension. Other mechanisms of hypertension in case of metabolic syndromes are there. As the abdominal adipose tissue is highly inflammatory substance, there will be the release of vasoactive substances from the adipose tissue. This leptin, pro-inflammatory cytokines, reactive oxygen species, tumor necrosis factor alpha will all be leading to circulation, will leading to hypertension. This coming to one more, this adiponectin. This is actually the adiponectin is a substance released from the abdominal fat. It is an anti-inflammatory cytokine. It is produced from the adipocytes. It increases insulin sensitivity. In the liver, it decreases gluconeogenesis. In muscle, it increases glucose uptake, and it increases fatty acid oxidation. That is, this adiponectin is a good hormone. In case of this metabolic syndrome, adiponectin levels are reduced in case of metabolic syndrome, leading to increased glucose in the blood. That is how the main components of the metabolic syndrome are developed in case of metabolic syndrome. Coming to next topic for clinical features, I think you can all read symptoms and signs. I have not elaborated. The associated features will be cardiovascular disease. In case of metabolic syndrome, with metabolic syndrome, the new onset cardiovascular disease will be threefold increase when compared to normal people without metabolic syndrome. The metabolic syndrome is attributable for 34% of cardiovascular disease in case of men and 16% of population in case of women. In type 2 diabetes, the metabolic in patients with metabolic syndrome, there will be a fivefold increase incidence of diabetes. 62% of men with diabetes are because of the metabolic syndrome, whereas 47% of women with diabetes have metabolic syndrome. The other manifestations of this metabolic syndrome are it can lead to non-alcohol fatty liver disease, hyperuricemia, PCOD, obstructive sleep apnea, peripheral arterial disease, and hyperviscosity syndromes. The laboratory tests, I think you can write normally. Coming to the treatment part, as you all know, the first management will be for this problem will be lifestyle. Coming to second part, Mediterranean diet is advised in case of metabolic syndrome. When the patient is at risk of metabolic syndrome, that is, you can go through this. This processed meat and red meat and sweets should be taken less often. Fish, seafoods should be taken at least 2 times per week. Eggs, poultry, cheese, yogurt, and other daily product daily to weekly you can take. And the daily meals, the olive and vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, legumes, grains, base every meals on these foods. This is actually Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet doesn't tell that how much percentage of the total energy you should take on carbohydrates, how much saturation. It is a holistic diet. Other things you can say: drink well, move well. This physical activity. The patients patients at risk for metabolic syndrome, if they follow the Mediterranean diet, it has been showed that at 6 years there will be 30% reduction in cardiovascular events, and the incidence of type 2 diabetes is also decreased by 30%. Coming to the third modality, physical activity. It has been advised that at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic physical activity and 75 minutes of vigorous activity is advised per week, and do muscle strengthening activities 2 or more days a week. Limit screen time and sitting time is advised. Behavior modification is one of the intervention you can see. And coming to, if the patient is excessively obese and the obesity is leading to metabolic syndrome, we should opt for techniques of decreasing the obesity, whether it can be like with physical activity, diet management, and other things. Along with that, drugs and surgeries also will help in case of in case of obesity. Weight loss drugs, there are two class of drugs: appetite suppressants and absorption inhibitors. I will show. Briefly, I will go through this table. There are, as I mentioned, there are appetite suppressants and absorption inhibitor. In this table, they accept this orally start. Other things are appetite suppressants: phentermine, lorcaserin, and a combination of phentermine and topiramate, naltrexone SR, and bupropion SR. These are all appetite suppressants. These weight loss drugs, appetite suppressants and absorption inhibitors. Phentermine, as we have seen in the table, it is a sympathomimetic drug. When used when compared to surgery and all, the weight reduction achieved with drug therapy is very less. This phentermine, it has been approved only for use for 3 months, whereas the combination of phentermine and topiramate, there is no restriction for how long the combination can be used. It will lead to 10% weight loss in case of in 50% of the people. The side effects are palpitations, headache, paresthesia, constipation, and insomnia. Coming to third drug, lorcaserin, it leads to only 5% weight loss. There is no restriction in the duration how it can be used, and side effects are headache and nasopharyngitis. Coming to the other class of drugs, absorption inhibitor, orlistat. It is a pancreatic lipase inhibitor. It inhibits fat absorption by 30%. It will only lead to 5% of weight loss. The side effect is oily leakage per rectum. This medical therapy, as we have seen, it hardly lead to 5 to 10% of weight loss. Coming to other modality of weight reduction, which is surgery. This surgical treatment are advised when in patients with metabolic syndrome and the BMI is more than 40, that is morbid obesity. If the patient's BMI is only more than 35, and when there is associated comorbidities like obstructive sleep apnea or other abnormalities, this surgery for weight loss can be advised. When compared to medical therapy, it leads to sustained results, sustained decrease in weight loss. This study, Swedish obese subject study, has showed that cardiovascular events will be decreased by 30% and cardiovascular death will be decreased by 50% over a course of 15 years. Bariatric surgeries can be two types: restrictive and hybrid. Restrictive are surgeries where we decrease only the quantity of food we intake. The first one, restrictive bariatric, we can do this by two methods: adjustable gastric banding. Here, this banding with the adjustment of this, the food we take can be adjusted, and sleeve gastrectomy. This hybrid bariatric surgeries are a combination of this restriction. Along with that, we will not allow this food we have taken and the gastric digestive enzymes and pancreatic digestive enzymes to meet, so that the digestion of the food which we have taken is not fully digested and absorbed. That is hybrid bariatric surgeries. The methods are this Roux-en-Y gastric bypass and biliopancreatic diversion with duodenal switch. The complications of bariatric surgeries are less than 40%, and 30-day operative mortality is only 0.1 to 1.2%. Coming to other management of dyslipidemia, I think you can write LDL cholesterol, what drugs, this statins and all, triglyceride, HDL cholesterol, this niacin and all. You can write. Blood pressure, sodium restriction. I have not elaborated because you can write this sodium restriction, and when case of suspicion of metabolic syndrome, after confirmation of the metabolic syndrome, ACE inhibitors and ARBs are preferred. They reduce the new onset diabetes in case of metabolic syndrome. Impaired fasting glucose, and coming to management of impaired fasting glucose and insulin resistance. As we know, this lifestyle, diet and physical activity is advised. To increase the insulin sensitivity, this biguanides and thiazolidinediones increase the insulin sensitivity. They enhance insulin action in liver and suppress the endogenous glucose production. Thiazolidinediones improve insulin-mediated glucose uptake in the muscle and adipose tissue, thus increasing the insulin sensitivity. They also have benefit in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, PCOD. They also decrease the markers of inflammation. Ashte metabolic syndrome. This I have combined little this drugs for the obesity and surgeries for the obesity, and how this obesity leads to metabolic syndrome, because there are two chapters in Braunwald. One chapter, obesity chapter, obesity and cardiometabolic syndrome. This is in brief. I think for 10 marks it will be sufficient. Hello? Hello? Oh.
Yeah, funny.
Yeah.
Well done. Thank you.
Yeah, because my audio is lost.
Galaxy 10.
Who is Galaxy 10? Lokesh.
Yeah, I am Galaxy 10.
Mediterranean diet has alcohol also, no?
Lokesh, start now.
Okay, I'll start. I will be covering myocardial viability basically, but I'll talk about myocardial ischemia in brief before that. Decreased coronary blood flow will lead to ischemia, subsequently injury, and then infarction, which is decided by whether occlusion is total or subtotal, abruptness with which it develops, time into ischemia, which is mainly decided by intervention or spontaneous reperfusion, O2 supply through collaterals or through subtotal occlusion itself, and O2 demand. When ischemia is there, if there is tachycardia or anemia, the supply itself won't be adequate in anemia, and in tachycardia demand will increase. So that will worsen the ischemia cascade. And the presence of preconditioning. All these factors will affect the ultimate development of ischemia and infarction. All these will lead to myocardial cell death via necrosis, apoptosis, and autophagy. As we all know, myocardial ischemia is basically supply-demand mismatch. The myocardial ischemia can be supply-induced ischemia, where if there is a transient coronary occlusion like vasospasm or thrombosis, there will be transmural initiation of transmural ischemia, which will lead to dilatation of ventricle, and it will increase the LV compliance. demand-induced ischemia, inability to increase coronary blood flow in response to myocardial oxygen demand, as it happens in left ventricular hypertrophy and fixed coronary obstruction. Actually, fixed coronary obstruction, when the resting blood flow is preserved, only CFR is exhausted. The symptoms or the ischemia will depend on the demand. If the demand increases, then only patient will become ischemic. Otherwise, he will preserve the myocardial function. So that will demand-induced ischemia will usually lead to subendocardial ischemia, and which will lead to decrease in the LV compliance and increase in the LVEDP. So what all things happen in ischemia? This is a very simplified thing. Total occlusion will cut off the coronary blood flow, which will lead to whatever blood is there in coronary, that will lead to increased O2 extraction from that blood, and there will be decreased coronary sinus O2 saturation. So because the myocardium has used up all the ATP, ATP will decrease, and within several beats, there will be regional cessation of contraction. Also, there will be which will lead to decrease in LV-DPDT and increase LV-EDP. Decrease in ATP will lead to leakage of potassium out of the cell. This happens usually late in the cascade. I will come to that, which is responsible for ST elation, as we all know. This is a ischemia cascade starting from normal to infarction. The first abnormality which is detected is molecular abnormality, which can be detected by spectroscopy. Second is perfusion abnormality. Third is diastolic or relaxation abnormalities, which can be detected by echo for diastolic dysfunction. There can be abnormal, fourth thing is abnormal tissue Doppler velocities or strain. Fifth is visible abnormally wall motion abnormality. Then comes ECG changes, and then comes the symptoms, angina. So this is a figure from Braunwald, which says when there is a complete occlusion, within 20 minutes, there will be immediately there will be stunning within few minutes, which will cause, which will also lead to preconditioning. I will come to all these things subsequently, but there won't be any necrosis within first 20 minutes. So if revascularization happens spontaneously or by intervention within 20 minutes, then the recovery will be maximum. From 20 to 60 minutes, there will be a subendocardial necrosis. So around less than one third of the myocardial thickness will be necrotic, and the remaining 2/3 can be preserved still. After 60 minutes to 3 hours, the necrosis extends into the myocardium from it extends from endocardium to epicardium like a frond, until eventually when only a thin strip of subepicardial myocardium is remaining at the end of 6 hours. This was about total occlusion. If there is a clinically significant stenosis, this is a diagram from Grossman, where it shows the relation between resting coronary blood flow and maximal coronary blood flow with relation to diameter stenosis. When the diameter stenosis becomes around 50%, the coronary flow reserve, that is maximal flow which can be achieved in a stenotic vessel, starts decreasing. So from 50 it starts decreasing, and around 75% even the resting flow starts decreasing. So if there is a stenosis which is more than 75%, which is decreasing the resting coronary blood flow, there will be subendocardial ischemia and contractile dysfunction. Then what are the protective mechanisms against this ischemia? Acute preconditioning, brief reversible ischemia episodes followed by prolonged ischemia will lead to decrease in the final necrosis. This is called acute preconditioning. Acute MI preceded by angina for variable duration, which is a common scenario which we see. Patient will usually have angina for a few days and then he will present with the ACS. In that case, he will have acute preconditioning, which will be protective. and it can be also induced by pharmacological agents in laboratory with adenosine. Delayed preconditioning. Chronic recurrent reversible ischemia followed by obstruction will again decrease necrosis as it decreases in acute preconditioning. This is called delayed preconditioning because it is happening recurrently. Both acute and delayed preconditioning will decrease the final myocardial infarct size and decrease the duration and intensity of stunning and will hasten the recovery. Coming to mechanisms of preconditioning, these are the 4 things given in Braunwald. It is because of increased protein synthesis, upregulation of nitric oxide, upregulation of cyclooxygenase, upregulation of mitochondrial potassium channels. Post-conditioning, this is the third mechanism. Cardiac protection, this is cardiac protection after the ischemia is already established. So perfusion injury, the mechanism for this is perfusion injury salvage kinase pathway, which limits development of mitochondrial permeability transition pore. If this transition pore develops in the mitochondria, then it will leak out its contents and that will lead to cell necrosis. So that is prevented by this pathway in post-conditioning. Now, again, these are diagrams from Braunwald. Now, if the ischemia develops, suppose it is acute, there is a suppose partial occlusion on the left side. So the difference between partial and total is that window period which it gives. So for total occlusion, there will be significant ischemia within 20 minutes, and in partial occlusion, it will give you a window of 5 hours. If you revascularize the in first 5 hours, there will be a transient hibernation, which is labeled in green, and it will the green thing is actually dilatation also. So in partial occlusion less than 5 hours, it will have acute hibernation, and if it is intervened in that period, then the hibernating myocardium will get converted to stunned myocardium, and over subsequent days it will get recovered as shown below in the diagram. Now, if the ischemia is prolonged for more than 5 hours, because it is partial occlusion, there will be patchy subendocardial infarction, like we call it enstemy. In total occlusion, the duration is very small, that is 20 minutes. Within 20 minutes, if you don't reperfuse, then it will lead to start of development of infarction, as I told above, that will be completed by 6 hours usually. So if the patient gets revascular within 20 minutes, there will be hibernation. After 20 minutes, if we reperfuse this myocardium, then there will be stunned myocardium after within 20 minutes, and that will get completely recovered within few hours, because this was very transient acute occlusion. If the ischemia remains for more than 20 minutes and there is a development of post-conditioning, as I told, which happens during the ischemia, there will again be limitation of infarct size. If there is no post-conditioning, then there will be full thickness diffuse infarction. If there is a post-conditioning, there will be patchy infarction. Again, if the occlusion is relieved spontaneously or by intervention, and there is reocclusion, this reocclusion has now caused preconditioning. So again, it will lead to limitation of infarct size by preconditioning. I'll come to this later. Then the fourth mechanism is stunning. Acute brief episodes of ischemia after reperfusion will have rapid recovery of function. Usually, if more the duration of ischemia, the more the duration of stunning there will be. Usually, if there is a 15-minute duration of ischemia, the duration of stunning will be 6 hours. If it is prolonged 2 hours, then the duration of stunning will be 7 hours, 7 days, up to 7 days. In stunning, basically, we have the perfusion is normal, either spontaneously or by intervention, but the function is decreased. But the function can be increased by stimulation. So that is the red things are the hallmarks of stunning, as we all know. Then the repeated episodes of stunning will lead to chronic stunning. Mechanisms for stunning are myocardial injury by free radicals and a decreased calcium sensitivity of excitation contraction coupling because of repeated ischemias. This will lead to decreased contractile function transiently, which usually improves by 7 days. Hibernation, myocardial. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
Lokesh, you're
yes.
audible.
Okay, fine. Hibernation. Coming to hibernation, myocardial region which improves after revascularization is hibernation. That is, in hibernation, the features are there will be chronically decreased blood flow, which will lead to downregulation of its regional function, as well as intra and extracellular degeneration. So, depending on adaptation and degree of degeneration which happens at the cellular level, the recovery can be either complete or partial, as shown in the table. The mechanisms for hibernation, which are given in Brownwood, are the 5 things which go on simultaneously are apoptosis, myocyte loss, and myofiber loss, cell survival, adaptive programs, metabolic and energetics get modified. They work at submaximal levels, and they are less affected by workloads. There will be blunted beta adrenergic responses, and these are the balances between these adaptive and degenerative changes usually predict the recovery, whether it will be complete or partial. So same thing which is shown in this table given in Brownwood. The viable, so basically viable dysfunctional myocardium can be because of transient reversible ischemia, chronic repetitive ischemia, or because of structural remodeling. In the transient reversible ischemia, there will be post-ischemic stunning, and the contractile reserve will be preserved, resting flow will be normal, extent of functional recovery normalizes within 24 hours in these patients. If there is also in transient reversible ischemia, the post-ischemic stunning and short-term hibernation usually occur simultaneously. So in short-term hibernation, the features will be the contractile reserve will be preserved, resting flow will be normal, extent of functional recovery normalizes. That the hibernation part usually takes 7 days, and the stunning part to recover takes 24 hours. So in same patient who has been subjected to ischemia, all the mechanism which I mentioned for ischemia and for protection also all come into action simultaneously. It is not like stunning happens at one time and hibernation is different from that. All of them are happening simultaneously. The only thing is degree of them is different. Then coming to reperfusion injury, this is a chart showing post-conditioning time on x-axis and cell death on y-axis. When there is a ischemia, the amount of cell death rapidly increases, and in the absence of any intervention or revascularization, the cell death will follow the dotted line, and it will eventually reach the myocardial injury, the black box, which is labeled myocardial injury. If there happens to be reperfusion at the white large arrow, still there will be some at that point the myocardial cell loss, which is attributable to ischemia, will stop, but further there will be some cell loss. That cell loss is called reperfusion injury. This reperfusion So in the end, the patient will have the cell loss, which is attributable to ischemia, plus that attributable to reperfusion injury. But combined, that will be definitely less than the that would have been in the absence of revascularization. So even if reperfusion injury is happening, it is saving some amount of cells behind. So what happens in ischemia is the cell will switch to anaerobic metabolism. There will be glycolysis, which will lead to increased formation of lactates, which will lower the pH. There will be impaired calcium handling. In ischemic cells, the MPTP is mitochondrial transition pore, where which is not opened. But when reperfusion happens, because reperfusion is happening, the neutrophils come in to the interstitium. They release reactive oxygen species. This reactive oxygen species will open the transition pore and will lead to leakage of its mitochondrial contents into the cell, and cell will get lysed. So that this is the mechanism for reperfusion injury. Reperfusion injury, which happens even if you have restored the blood flow.
Lokesh,
Yeah.
this preconditioning, like if there is an occlusion happens and within 20 minutes, suppose it is recanalized, the myocardial, we can say that the myocardial is subjected to preconditioning, correct? No?
Yeah.
Okay. So now when is it called the post conditioning then?
Post conditioning is when ischemia is going on.
No, in that case, if it is within 20 minutes, if you have opened, then also patient had an ischemia, no? Still it is called preconditioning.
No, it is preconditioning for the subsequent ischemia. It is not for that episode. The next ischemia episode which happens, that episode will have protection.
And what is that in post conditioning then? Hello? Then what is post conditioning?
Post conditioning is which happens with the ischemia. Suppose you have got coronary ischemia. With the coronary ischemia, you will have activation of that.
Okay, so if
that pathway will block your MPTP opening and cytolysis. So that thing is post conditioning.
And that
how that happens, that Brownell is not given.
Okay, post conditioning leads to infarction, no? Like
post conditioning also will prevent your cell loss.
It prevents cell loss, but usually whenever the post conditioning has happened, some of the myocardium is already lost, no? Like if it would have been acute, it would not have lost. It would be then similar to a preconditioning, no?
No, the only difference between the two is preconditioning is suppose I'm having 10 episodes of ischemia today. Those 10 episodes of ischemia will prevent the damage which is going to happen from ACS, which is going to happen tomorrow.
Okay.
Post conditioning is if I'm not, suppose I'm not having any 10 episodes of ischemia, I directly have a myocardial infarction. During that myocardial infarction, that pathway gets activated, and that pathway will lead to post conditioning. It is just terms are different. And mechanisms are different.
Okay, fine.
Coming to the dark side of reperfusion, the reperfusion can be good, which will eventually which can end with arrhythmia, like which are called reperfusion arrhythmias, and patient will settle. Or it can be bad, which will lead to myocardial stunning for long time and will subject the patient to heart failure. And it can be ugly if there is microvascular obstruction, no reflow phenomenon, or microvascular hemorrhage. Coming to the topic proper, viable myocardium. myocardium in which contractile function is expected to improve or progressive adverse remodeling can be avoided once coronary blood flow is restored is called viable myocardium. Indications to check for viable myocardium are heart failure with reduced ejection fraction with coronary artery disease. The goals of viability assessment in chronic ischemic LV dysfunction are identification of patients that would benefit from revascularization the most, prediction of recovery, and in advanced congestive heart failure, help decide management between revascularization versus LVAD or transplant. What they say is, before, if the patient has heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and coronary artery disease, before the patient he is advised LVAD or transplant, he should undergo coronary revascularization. In this scenario, in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction with coronary artery disease, ESC gives it 2B indication to assess myocardial viability. In CTO PCI, before doing CTO PCI, the myocardial viability assessment should be done, which is class 2A indication according to ESC, and also 48 hours of post MI. Actually, routine PCI 48 hours post MI is not recommended by STEMI guidelines, but this revascularization guidelines, that also mentions the sentence underlined in green, that is routine PCI of occluded infarct-related artery after MI in stable patients should not be done. But the thing in red brackets I want to emphasize, in patients presenting days after acute event with completed MI, only those with recurrent angina or documented residual ischemia and proven viability on non-invasive imaging in a large coronary artery diarrhea should be considered for revascularization, even if the coronary artery is occluded. This doesn't have any recommendation, but fourth indication is chronic stable angina, but in that case, it is for restratification. That it is not actually for viability; it is for ischemia. Because we are doing same test, put the test which we are going to do for assessment of viability are same for assessment of ischemia also. So indication I have put there, nothing else. Now when and which patients to do viability? Viability testing is usually not needed and unlikely to add any useful information when the patient is young. There is angina class more than class 2. Already some test has proven moderate to severe ischemia. EF is more than 40%. There is a left main coronary artery disease, and there are no or limited comorbidities. In these conditions, usually viability is not done. So when does viability come into action? It should be done in older patient who will have increased risk. Heart failure with reduced ejection fraction without angina. Here it can be done whether there is any scope for improvement in ejection fraction. When there is no evidence of ischemia, moderate to large persistent perfusion defect suggesting scar, but maybe hibernating. When the EF is low, that is 40%. In chronic total occlusions, as I mentioned above, when there are severe multiple comorbidities which makes the patient high risk for any intervention. So in that case, you should be sure that what you are doing is correct and will be benefiting the patient without harming. So what are the modalities which can be used to assess viability? ECG, echo as we all know, then dobutamine stress echo, SPECT, PET, and MRI. So 6 modalities. I would like to show you some figures. Actually, the MRI has both high sensitivity and high specificity, and also very high positive predictive value and negative predictive value. So over time, maybe in few years, MRI is going to succeed all the above investigations. This is based on multiple compilation of multiple randomized control trials. another paper where it shows that the highest specificity again is for MRI, followed by dobutamine stress echo, and highest sensitivity is for again MRI, followed by PET. The point is, in both the tables, which have actually compiled slightly different studies, has come to conclusion that MRI has overall very high sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value for assessment of viability. So to summarize these tables, most specific is dobutamine stress MRI, slightly more than dobutamine stress echo. Most sensitive is delayed enhancement cardiac MRI, slightly more than PET. Highest positive predictive value is of dobutamine stress CMR, which is almost equal to PET, and highest negative predictive value is CMR. So all four parameters are favoring CMR. At present, the ESC guideline, which mentions class 2B indication for viability assessment before doing any revascularization in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and coronary artery disease, gives it class 2B indication, and it doesn't mention which of these modalities has to be preferred. It just enlists the modalities which can be done. It just enlists all the 6 modalities. So approach to any ischemic cardiomyopathy, which is basically EF less than 40%. So all these patients has to be on optimal medical management. If these patients have heart failure, the green section, we have to weigh the interventional revascularization procedure risk versus its benefit. If the risk is very high, we should continue medical management. And despite that, if he is having persistent symptoms, after considering viability testing only, he should be subjected for revascularization. If the procedural risk is low or intermediate, and your angiogram is showing high-risk anatomy. What is high-risk anatomy? It is more than 50% LMCS stenosis or proximal LAD lesion. In that case, without bypassing the viability imaging, you can directly consider revascularization. If in heart failure patient who has lower intermediate risk for intervention, has obstructive CAD without high-risk features, you have to subject him for viability assessment. If there is no viability, you have to continue OMT. If there is viability, you do revascularization. This obstructive CAD also includes CTO. So coming to the left-hand side, if the patient with ischemic cardiomyopathy is having angina, because he's having angina, that means he is having viable myocardium. In that case, viability imaging is not required. But considering such patients, because he is having reduced EF, we have to consider his again risk profile. If risk profile is high, we have to optimize his heart failure medications. Despite that, if he is having persistent symptoms, then only go for revascularization. So coming to basic principles of these modalities, I will be mainly focusing on these 4 things. One is dobutamine stress echo, SPECT, PET, and CMR. The dobutamine stress echo, the principle is to elicit contractile reserve from the myocardium. I'll describe these mechanisms in brief further. The mechanism is sarcolemmal membrane integrity. Hello?
Lokesh?
Yeah.
Lokesh, try putting it in landscape. No, I think it will be better.
You're not able to see?
No, I didn't. Like instead of zooming every time, just try landscape once. It's not working because the font is quite small. Yeah, I think this is better. Yeah. What about for others? For me, it's better.
Yeah, this is better.
Okay. So for SPECT with thallium, the principal site of action is sarcolemmal membrane integrity. If the membrane is intact, then only thallium can enter the cell, and which will be detected by tracers. For technetium, it is mitochondrial membrane integrity. For PET scan, it is the metabolism which the myocardial cells utilize, and for CMR, it is LG. I will come to those. So coming to dobutamine stress echo, the principle is when you give dobutamine, there will be increased cardiac workload, which will increase the O2 demand and will cause demand supply mismatch, leading to ischemia. So once ischemia happens, there will be impairment of myocardial thickening and endocardial motion. So which we see on dobutamine stress echo. So the 4 patterns which we see normal is when the rest and stress both the times the regional wall motion is normal. In ischemia, the rest is normal, but stress will be abnormal because of the demand supply mismatch. In necrotic, both stress and rest will be abnormal. When there is a viability, the rest will be abnormal. Stress will make it normal, or it will become biphasic. What is biphasic response? There is initial improvement due to recruitment of contractile reserve at low dose dobutamine, but at high dose dobutamine, because there is a tight stenosis that will cause that will decrease the coronary blood flow and cause subendocardial ischemia, causing again wall motion abnormality. So wall motion abnormality will improve and then again become abnormal. So then this has high likelihood of recovery. Then there is uniphasic response, which is less predictive of recovery. I have covered all these modalities not much in detail because we can't write everything when viability is asked. So coming to SPECT, SPECT is basically single photon emitting computed tomography, where we use gamma emitting isotopes, and gamma camera, which is housed in a rotating gantry, is used. So we give the patient a gamma emitting isotope like thallium or technetium. What thallium does is, thallium is like a potassium. Potassium, as we know, is basically intracellular ion. So thallium tries to replace the potassium from inside the cells. So over time, thallium will replace the potassium from inside the cells and then will accumulate inside the cells. This can only happen if the cell is intact. If the cell is only not there, thallium can't accumulate in any infarcted or dead tissue. So the prerequisite for thallium accumulation is the intact cell and its intact sarcolemmal membrane, which has intact potassium pumps. So way for technetium, actually technetium has lesser uptake as compared to thallium, but once it has been taken up, the uptake is fixed and it binds to mitochondria once inside the cell. These are the protocols which I have put. You can go through them later, how to do the SPECT imaging and all. Only thing which I want to show is the technetium scan. Before giving a technetium, you should give 400 micrograms of nitroglycerin. What this does is, that will cause microvascular dilatation. Suppose if you give a technetium without giving NTG, then sometimes what happens is, because the coronary stenosis is tight, the technetium, when you image the patient under gamma camera, you won't see any uptake in the region of interest. It is just because the microvasculature is not properly dilated. When you give NTG, microvasculature will dilate, the technetium will reach there, and then it will be taken up. So NTG has to be given before giving technetium, mainly because the uptake is also slow.
Lokesh,
Hello, yeah.
this NTG
Sorry?
predominantly acts on.
Your voice is coming from very far, man.
Sorry. Hello.
Yeah.
I am saying that this NTG is predominantly acting on the epicardial coronaries, right? For microvasculature, otherwise we use adenosine only. So, how much is it applicable here? Hello.
This is to
Maybe it
this is to make the
maybe
this is to
make the
make the
collaterals
tracer
open
reach
maybe.
the cells for uptake. See, we give NTG for thallium also. Like especially if you want to skip the 24 hours. I mean, nowadays nobody does thallium, but the 24 hours additional imaging, if you want to skip that, you can basically give NTG and do it. But as a routine protocol, it is not used in thallium, but for technetium, it's used as a routine protocol. And like Lokesh said, the reason why we give it is to make sure that you are trying to assess the cells, you're not trying to assess the amount reaching the cell. If the cell doesn't take it up, you are trying in the rest imaging. If the cell doesn't take it up, you are calling it non-viable. For that, the tracer should have reached the cell and the cell membrane integrity be disrupted that it doesn't uptake it, rather than a mechanical obstruction for it to reach there.
And for that, you're giving adenosine anyway. So, or
Coming to differences between thallium and technetium.
Lokesh, once again. Varun,
Yeah.
adenosine we give it for technetium scan routinely for stress.
We don't give. We don't give.
no. I meant stress, not adenosine. Stress.
Stress. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, for vasodilator stress, which is mentioned here, you can give adenosine or dipyridamole. Coming to differences between thallium and technetium. You can go through these, nothing great in that. Then coming to the interpretation of these scans, when suppose you are doing a technetium scan, if there is a perfusion defect at rest, the usual technetium scan is done at rest and then at stress. When there is a perfusion defect at rest and at stress also it is remaining, then it is either infarct or attenuation artifact. You have to distinguish. It is difficult to distinguish sometimes, so people end up giving the report as infarct. When for technetium and thallium both, when the myocardium at rest is not showing any perfusion defect, but when subjected to stress shows a perfusion defect, is actually indicator of inducible ischemia and viability. Actually, the stress, in protocol, stress is done first. So when you stress the myocardium, you will only the normal myocardium will take up the tracer, leaving the perfusion defect. Now you allow the recovery, and during recovery, because you have injected the tracer before, slowly its ischemic perfusion defect will also take up the the tracer and will glow up. So if that happens, then it is inducible. Then it is inducible ischemia and viability. For thallium, what they used to do is give thallium at rest. Hello?
Lokesh, your voice was not audible for a while. Please
Yeah.
show me.
A brief bit we lost you.
Okay, thallium. From where? This last
Just-
one?
Thallium.
Yeah, thallium. 10 seconds. 10 seconds. That's all.
Okay. Coming to thallium, when we find a perfusion defect at rest, they used to do redistribution imaging at 24 hours. And if that is getting filled up, then it is viable. If that is not getting filled up even after 24 hours, that means the thallium is not being taken up by the cells. That is the sign of scar. So how the viability is assessed in thallium is by seeing a redistribution imaging after 24 hours. As versus technetium, where you induce stress first, which will cause a perfusion defect, and after during recovery you will see even the perfusion defect is glowing up. That is how you assess viability. Actually, some slight difference between the two. Then how do you report a myocardial perfusion imaging? You report it as the perfusion defect size. It can be small when it is less than 10% of the total LV volume. It is less than 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 40%, or more than 40%. Classified as small, moderate, large, and extensive as compared to the left ventricular volume. Second, the second thing which we report is perfusion defect severity. Actually, there will be a database in the software which will be knowing the baseline intensity of the uptake. So if the baseline intensity is considered as 100, if it is the intensity is decreased by less than 40%, it is called mild defect. If it is 40 to 60% decrease, then it is called moderate defect. If it is more than 60% decrease, then it is called severe. And if there is no uptake, obviously it is absent perfusion. Then the location, as we all know, it is given as per 17 segment model. Then perfusion defect reversibility indicators. What we get from the 17 segment model is basically a polar map. So this polar map we get during stress imaging and during rest imaging. So that if there is an improvement between the rest and stress imaging of 2 or more points, then it suggests a good reversibility, good chance of reversibility. It can also be used for predicting future cardiac events. So there is something called summed rest score and some stress score. So in this event evaluation, what we measure is summed stress score. In the 17 segment model of LV, each segment is scored from 0 to 4. 0 is normal perfusion, 1 is mildly reduced perfusion, 2 is moderately reduced perfusion, 3 is severely reduced perfusion, and 4 is absent perfusion. Like that, it is graded from 0 to 4. And wherever there is a reduction in the uptake, those points are counted, and the sum of the scores is calculated. If it is 0 to 3, it is normal risk. If it is 4 to 7, it is low risk. If it is 8 to 12, it is intermediate risk. If it is more than 12, it is high risk. The additional cardiac findings which we can get from SPECT is we can see left ventricular valve motion and function. We can see chamber sizes. Right ventricular perfusion and function can be visualized. Presence of left ventricular dilatation during the stress, which is actually a marker of severe significant ischemia. And many extracardiac findings can be noted in the adjacent organs or tissues like lymph nodes. Coming to PET. PET is positron emission tomography. Positron is nothing but positively charged electron. When you inject a tracer which has positively charged, which can emit a positively charged electron, this tracer will go to the tissue. It will combine with negatively charged electron, which is normally there. And once this fusion happens, this fusion will create 2 photons, which travel in 180 degree opposite directions. So these photons can be acquired and imaged by PET scanner, which is again like a CT scan machine, which has a rotating gantry. So these 2 photons can be detected by a rotating gantry. What PET does is PET usually involves perfusion tracers, like which we saw in technetium. These are only for perfusion, whether perfusion is there or not. When tracer is given, if the myocardium is taking it up, it will tell you whether perfusion is there or not, but doesn't tell you about viability. For viability in PET, you give FDG. What is the rationale of giving FDG? I'll tell you. Glucose, the normal cardiac muscle utilizes fatty acids, and when there is ischemia, that is decreased blood flow or decreased oxygen, or there is a glucose loading, the free fatty acid metabolism will decrease and glucose utilization will increase. What happens in diabetics is there will be impaired utilization of glucose and body will continue to use free fatty acids in spite of having high sugars. This mainly happens because of insulin resistance. Because insulin resistance is there, even cardiac muscle is not able to utilize the glucose despite having it in abundance. So if suppose the patient is diabetic, even if he has high sugars, if you because he has diabetes, he will have insulin resistance because you are just labeling the glucose molecule with 18 fluoride. Even if you inject that into the patient who is diabetic, it won't be taken up by the myocardium because that uptake needs insulin. So what you need to do in diabetics is you have to see how much are the sugars. If sugars are more than 250, you have to administer insulin until you bring down his blood sugars to 100 to 140. If his blood sugar is already less than 250, then you have to give glucose load to stimulate his own insulin secretion, or you can add you can give glucose plus insulin both, so that you stimulate the glucose uptake into the myocardium. Because without doing that, if you give FDG, it won't be taken up and you will get erroneous results. So how to interpret PET scan is, if the two things basically you see is you do two things in PET. One is perfusion with N13 ammonia or rubidium 82. If the perfusion is, and the second thing is FDG PET. If the myocardium is viable, then the glucose will be taken up by the cells. So if perfusion is preserved and even FDG is preserved, that means it is normal myocardium. If there is a perfusion defect, but it is getting that defect is getting lightened up on after giving FDG, then it is hibernating myocardium. That is, the perfusion tracer is not reaching the myocardium in given time, but FDG is able to reach and is being utilized by the cells there. That means the cells in that area are viable. This is called mismatch defect. If there is a perfusion defect which stays as a defect after giving FDG also, that means there is a scar. There is no living tissue there. There is something called reverse mismatch, where the perfusion is normal, but FDG uptake is low, or there is a defect. That can happen in stunned myocardium or in presence of LBV. Then I have summarized the differences between SPECT and PET. SPECT is gamma emitting. SPECT uses gamma emitting traces like technetium 99, thallium, and iodine 131. PET uses positron emitting F18. SPECT uses gamma camera mounted on the rotating gantry, and PET uses PET camera, which detects these photons after combination of positively charged electron and negatively charged electron. SPECT is less costlier. The tracers have long half-lives. Because they have long half-lives, the scanning time is longer. Because they have long half-lives, the radiation exposure is much more. But the radio tracers are cheap here. As compared to PET is much costlier. The tracers which are used are very short-lived. They have to be manufactured in the same place because they have very short half-life. That they are difficult to transport. The scan time is shorter, that is 30 to 40 minutes usually. Because the half-life is shorter, the radiation exposure is very less, but the disadvantage is it is costlier. Coming to disadvantages of SPECT, SPECT is prone to artifacts which can be diagnosed as perfusion defects. SPECT cannot measure coronary blood flow. Advantages with PET are better resolution. It is less prone to artifacts and can measure coronary blood flow. Coming to CMR, this is a diagram which shows
Okay.
how Gadol. Yeah, tell.
This one in that PET scan, why the scarred myocardium will because scarred myocardium contains this fibroblast and collagen, no? So they should also should at least take up the glucose, no?
Yeah, but the cellularity is very less. The cells are very less.
Okay.
So even if they take up, you won't see the lightning.
Correct. Okay.
Coming to CMR, how gadolinium is taken up. In normal myocardium, where the sarcolemma is intact, the gadolinium won't be able to enter the cell membrane into the cell. When there is infarction, the cell membrane becomes leaky. So because the cell membrane is leaky, it is able to enter the cell. So when patient has ischemia or injury or infarction, where the sarcolemma is disrupted, gadolinium can enter and will be seen as gadolinium enhancement. Also in scar is disorganized, very disorganized structure. So it will again take up gadolinium and it will be bright. So coming to patterns of gadolinium enhancement, the subendocardial location favors ischemia, and the subendocardial location should be confined to the coronary artery territories. When the ischemia happens, it usually progresses from the endocardium to the epicardium. So initial stages of ischemia will show you subendocardial enhancement. If there is a transmural ischemia, the entire thickness of the myocardium will be involved. The other side is non-ischemic, as we all know. Then what do you see on CMR is in fact transmurality. If the transmurality is 1 to 25%, the viability is usually preserved. 25 to 50% again viability is preserved. What they say, so the cutoff is 50%. If the transmurality is less than 50%, then the viability is said to be preserved. If it is more than 50%, then it is absent. Then thin myocardium. Usually, how conventionally they used to assess viability with echo is if the thickness of the myocardium on echo is less than 6 millimeters, then that myocardium is supposed to be non-viable. That is followed at some places till now, and conventionally that was labeled as non-viable. But what MRI has shown is even if the myocardium is thin, that can have a capacity to recover its thickness and contractility. What it showed is even if the myocardial thickness is less than in this study, which is quite large study for MRI, it involved 1,200 patients, where out of 1,200 patients, 18% of the patients had transmural extent of infarction of less than 15%, despite having a thickness of less than 5.5 millimeters, which showed a significant improvement in function and regained its thickness on revascularization. So this is the only modality where even if the thickness is not there, you can still get a benefit of revascularization. Contractile reserve on dobutamine stress. It is similar to dobutamine stress echo. Actually, this should be used as an adjunct to LG, but absence of contractile reserve does not rule out viability, because LG is excellent in detecting viability. For CMR also detects microvascular obstruction. Actually, this modality is gold standard for diagnosis of microvascular obstruction. It occurs in more than 50% of the STEMIs. and microvascular obstruction is adverse prognostic marker for adverse LV remodeling.
Lokesh,
Yeah,
how much did you say the transmural thickness of LG should be there to call viable or non-viable?
50% is cut off.
Okay, because that day in class, Ashita madam told I think 75.
Yeah, there are two references. Most of the references say 50.
50 is
The
what I remembered also.
other few references say 75 also. It includes
No, no,
less
no.
than 75 also.
See, what she said is
She has
more than
conducted
75, there is
0% chance.
0% viability. 50 to 70, there are still people who can. We don't know who will actually benefit, but it is not absolute zero. More than 50, it's not a dichotomous thing. This picture
Yeah,
only
yeah.
what he's saying.
Okay.
But though it says viability absent, it is not 0%. There is some amount.
The thing is,
It's a linear
different
curve.
references are different thing. This reference says cutoff is 50%, and there are other references also which I found which says cutoff is 75%.
No, that's what Lokesh. When they calculated the median value, it fell somewhere around 50. The correlation. That's why they arbitrarily call it as 50%.
Yeah.
Okay.
So these are pros and cons of each modality. The table I got from one of the articles. You can go through that. Coming to echo, as I said, LV thickness less than 6 millimeters is usually considered non-viable, which is not reliable as shown by MRI nowadays. Coming to ECG, presence of Q wave does not mean that it is non-viable. ECG has very limited value if there are presence of these factors. If there is LBB, pace rhythm, baseline STD changes, digital is used, then ECG, the reliability of ECG in predicting anything is lost, whether it is ischemia or viability. Then coming to contrast myocardial echo, I could not read this, so I have left it blank. Actually, it was. I'll put it up while putting it up. By tomorrow, I'll add and put it. Coming to evidence for all this, Stitch trial, which came in 2011, coronary artery bypass surgery in patients with left ventricular dysfunction. It involved 1,200 patients with age more than 18 years, EF less than 35 years, and coronary artery disease suitable for revascularization. So it divided the patients into OMT plus CABG versus OMT alone. The primary outcome of was all-cause mortality, which was found equal at around 4 years of follow-up of the study. But the secondary outcomes of CV death was significantly less in CABG group. And when combination of all-cause mortality and CV hospitalization was taken, that was also significantly low in CABG arm. The inclusion criteria for Stitch trial were age more than 18 years, coronary artery disease suitable for revascularization, EF less than 35%. But exclusion criteria which should be noted are they excluded critical LMCA disease or acute coronary syndrome. Recent MI with LV dysfunction they excluded. So Stitch trial cannot be applied to a patient who had recent MI and has LV dysfunction. Then high-risk patients were excluded. Those with life expectancy less than 3 years were excluded. Then the 10-year follow-up of Stitch came, which showed significant reduction in all these three parameters, that is all-cause mortality, CV death, and death from any cause or cardiovascular hospitalization at 10 years of follow-up. All three had significant difference at 10 years follow-up. This was Stitch's trial. Then coming to viability sub-study of Stitch, in the Stitch patients, 81% of the patients had viable myocardium, 19% had, and 19% had no viability. when these groups were compared, there was significant association between viability and outcome and the all-cause mortality outcome by univariate analysis, but it could not meet the significance when compared by multivariate analysis. So based on this, ESC recommends that non-invasive stress imaging like CMR, stress echo, SPECT, or PET may be considered for assessment of myocardial ischemia and viability in patients with heart failure and coronary artery disease before decision on revascularization. That is class 2B indication. Coming to the PET and recovery following revascularization 2 trial, that is PAR 2 trial. This is the only trial involving FDG PET in evaluation of in viability. It involved 430 patients with EF less than 35. And there were two groups. One is FDG guided therapy group and one is standard therapy group. The patients who underwent PET assisted management showed non-significant trend towards reduction in primary or composite endpoints of CV death, MI, and rehospitalization for angina and heart failure at 12 months follow-up. In post-hoc analysis, there was significant reduction in adverse events in patients that adhered to PET recommendations for revascularization. So what PAR did is it divided the patient into FDG guided therapy and standard therapy. In FDG guided therapy, even if the FDG after FDG PET they had viability, actually in only 25% of the patients the FDG guided therapy was followed. In the remaining 75%, it was not followed. So that led to a non-significant. The result was non-significant trend towards reduction in primary composite endpoints. But when post-hoc analysis was done, taking into account only those 25% of the patients who had actually followed the PET advice, there was significant reduction in the primary outcome at 5 years follow-up. So this was a positive trial with FDG PET. Coming to VIAMI trial, which came in 2014. This trial included 261 patients were taken after 48 hours of anti-revol MI. Within 72 hours after the MI, they underwent viability testing, and those who had viable myocardium had significantly less ischemic events if they were revascularized at the end of 1 year. So again, VIAMI trial was positive, which was done in acute MI setting. Then recently in 2015, one Giulio Panza et al. Study I found, which was done with 601 patients, and the patient subset was same as the STITCH trial, that is heart failure reduced ejection fraction with EF less than 35 with CAD. They used DSE and or SPECT, or in some patients both, for viability assessment. This study by Giulio Panza, which involved 601 patients, showed improvement in LVEF, but there was no mortality benefit. Finished.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Thank you. It was very good.
Dimpu, anything?
Okay, nice presentation.
Okay.
That this thing you said, no, 18% patients in CMR may have a thinned myocardium but not have a transmural scar.
Yeah.
So that is basically being described by that Dipin Shah group basically. So he was a guy So what they found, they had some peculiar characteristics, that group, that 18% which you mentioned.
Okay.
One was that they called it extreme hibernation, extreme form of hibernation, where even it lost its thickness itself. That's one thing. And second thing is that those groups, when they had looked back at the DSCs which they have done, they found that they had a uniphasic a uniphasic response mostly, not the biphasic response. That is one. And second thing is that those patients had what is this? The most of them, 80 to 90% of those 18% group had 99 to 100% occlusions of the arteries. So these two peculiarities they found. So they said that those results should be interpreted in light of those. What I mean to say is that in a patient with MRI where you're seeing like usual cutoff for echo for viability is 6 and for MRI is 5.5. So this is based on again correlation studies with SPECT and other multimodality imaging mostly. So if you are finding a patient who has MRI thickness of less than 5.5, to think that actually that could still be this form of extreme hibernation and not interpret that as a non-viable. You should interpret it in the light of a patient having almost a near occlusion or 99%. I mean, like there should be a significant reduction in the resting blood flow. That's what they said. And they could have, they're most likely not likely to have this biphasic response. They usually have a uniphasic, like it is a downhill and it remains the same during a high low stress echo also. So that was the comments those authors had given for that 18% they have mentioned in that study. You mentioned that 18% from the Dipincha study only, no, Lokesh? Same only.
Yeah, from same study, Dipincha.
Okay. Yeah. And I wanted to ask if anybody has come across a protocol where we give technetium after 24 hours, like, what we do here, where we do rest and call them, because we usually use system EB and tetrophosphane. Both of these are technetium only. We don't use thallium. So what is the point why we are doing it after 24 hours? Any idea? I mean, I didn't listen that class which Kallur sir said. Did he mention anything about that?
No, he's not calling after 24 hours for technician. Half-life is only 6 hours. It will get washed away. When if you call after 24 hours, you won't see anything.
No, but he calls after 24 hours. That
No,
is
here
sure.
we call them the next day, no, Lokesh?
Yeah.
We do a rest.
See what he told. I attended it. He said
No, thallium makes sense, but why technetium? We do 2 injections, right? We first day we do. I mean, I'm talking about here protocol. We give a stress imaging and then call them the next day for rest imaging, or vice versa. If there is time, if there is only some tracer left, they say they'll do the rest and then they'll call them back the next day for stress. So isn't it inaccurate? Or is it mentioned as a protocol anywhere? Anybody has an idea?
Even I read the guidelines for doing nuclear studies.
Not
in
there,
American.
no?
It's not there like this.
But that is what we do, no? We don't use thallium. We use mostly technetium only, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. We are, what Dimpu is saying is the standard thing which we are doing. Okay, which is weird, which is, I don't know. I also never came across this. Even in first year, I had this doubt.
And then second again patient comes, you are giving contrast or not? Trace or not?
Sorry?
Second day you are giving tracer or not?
We are. One
then
is stress imaging, other one is rest imaging.
Then what we are doing is we are giving stress. We are doing stress imaging on first day. sending off the patient without doing a stress imaging after 3 to 4 hours, which we are supposed to do in technician. So to cut short that 3 to 4 hour waiting period, they are calling the patient next day, giving the technician again, exposing him to radiation again, and then imaging the rest sequences. So
That's what the
funda behind this is
whole business of calling the
funda behind this is if you do stress technician scan, and if it is normal, you need not do the rest imaging.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then
So for
What,
that,
what did you say? What did you say? Hello?
Hello?
Lokesh, what did you say?
he mentioned that if the stress is normal, there is no need to do a rest.
Yeah, correct. But then again, if the stress is abnormal, like if there is some defect, then why are we calling them after 24 hours is with that technetium thing?
No, he should not wait for 3 to 4 hours, etc.
We don't have thallium, no? Varun?
No, we don't have thallium at all. We don't have. We have only tetrophosphine and systemib.
Okay.
Thallium is not used anywhere in the world.
We mostly do tetrophosphate. Oh yeah, basically thallium is better than technetium, but it has a longer half-life. I think that is the reason why. I mean, it's some 74 hours or 75 hours, something like that. But that has the maximum uptake by myocardium though.
But it has poor resolution under gamma camera.
Correct. That is a thing which is like that's what Braunwald gives. No? Like you overcome that. It is below the limit of detectability by gamma camera, which is why when I did PET versus thallium studies, I think 20 to 25% were rendered. Non-viable things were rendered viable by PET.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, but not for technetium. That's for thallium. The main reason is because of this thing that actually it falls below the detectable limit of the gamma camera.
Even if you compare technetium with PET is better. Because even if you compare SPECT with technetium versus PET
is better. Yeah.
PET is better. Only thing, it is costly and availability is less. So not many studies.
One small additional thing about this thing I wanted to tell about Q waves on ECG. Actually, Q waves on ECG have very low sensitivity but very high specificity. Like in fact, specificity is much higher than dobutamine stress echo. Like what I mean by that is if there is no Q wave, then so I mean if the Q wave is there, then it doesn't mean that the chance of you being able to pick up viable versus non-viable myocardium is lesser, somewhere around 30% only. But if there is no Q wave, then it rules out.
NPV is high, you mean, right?
NPV, negative predictive value is almost 80%. None of the other things have that much of a negative predictive value for this thing, for ECG wise presence of Q waves. One more thing was about this myocardial contrast echo. If we are to talk about basically a hypoperfused myocardium, so I think all of us know that flash replenishment method. Basically, when we give a microbubble contrast, the number of cycles after we flash them, like destruct the bubbles, and the number of cycles it takes for it to fill up the myocardium is what the blood. Is dependent on the blood flow, and it usually normally takes 5 cycles in a normally perfused myocardium and 2 to 3 cycles in a Dobut stress echo setting. So if in case it is anything lesser than these cutoffs, it is abnormal perfusion, and it is laborious, not recommended, and not done also, but it's just for knowledge sake. That's all. And we have it like Sonoview Vision. We have it in our institute. So in case somebody is interested, they can do. And the other advantage of this thing MR, which Lokesh was saying, is that as mentioned, that MVO, micro vascular obstruction, which is again something which can be picked up using this myocardial contrast echo, is what they say. MVO specifically can be picked up between these two.
Lokesh,
Yeah.
this thing, you remember we had done that viability seminar with this thing in class, like you had prepared half the slides, I had prepared, and then I had presented. You were not
Remember-
able to attend during your A unit time, man.
Yeah.
You remember? Yeah, in that, I specifically remember that the most specific was DST, dobutamine stress echo, and most sensitive, as you said. So, like, I maybe what you are saying has been updated. So I just wanted to confirm that.
What I showed
No.
is from 2019 and 2018 articles.
No.
Okay.
Obviously, CMR is more reproducible than echo, no, Gaurav? So you are using the same Dobute. If Dobute stress echo is high sensitivity, then Dobute CMR should be much more than that, no? Because
No, that is what I think that data which I presented was not with dobutamine stress MRI. It was
even now
UC
we don't do
versus-
dobutamine stress echo MRI that much actually. But if you can do it, it is something which is because gating becomes difficult. That is the reason why. And because it increases the heart rate also. So you need a very high definition MRI machines to actually produce that kind of gating. That is the main problem if to do a dobutamine stress this thing, and why they use adenosine stress. But anyways, but then if you are able to do a dobute stress MRI, then its resolution should definitely be more than an echo, what you can see on it.
Okay. Okay, it's 11:30 now.
Sure. Thanks, Lokesh. Nice compilation. I think it's more
Thank
than
you,
enough.
Lokesh.
Bye bye.